The boy missing after the Anchorage power outage. Neighbors in South Edition remember the night the streetlights failed and the block turned to quiet shapes against Cook Inlet. A rolling outage moved across Anchorage after sunset, reportedly tied to an equipment fault at a substation near Tudor. Within that dark window, a 12-year-old boy left a duplex stairwell and was not seen returning by anyone nearby. The disappearance was recorded in dispatch logs as a welfare check that escalated when the caller could not reach family members. Investigators never confirmed the exact minute he stepped off the landing, and surviving records conflict on the sequence that followed. The boy was named Connor Price, age 12, a sixth grader whose mother worked nights as a certified nursing assistant. She was 39, employed at a facility near Lake Otis, and she left home before the outage reached the neighborhood. Her brother, age 34, an auto parts clerk, reportedly checked on Connor after dinner and found him watching storm updates. The uncle told officers he planned a quick drive toward Midtown for batteries, then doubled back when the traffic signals died. State records list his return time as approximate, and some locals claimed they saw the car pass once without stopping. The second person in the case file is Michael Reese, age 47, a floor technician assigned to overnight cleaning at a public office. He rented a ground floor unit in the same building, and he told officers he met the boy a handful of times. Reese said he heard a door close during the outage and looked through a peephole toward the landing. The hallway was dark, the emergency light flickering, and a shoe squeaked once on painted concrete. Archived notes say Reese could not identify whose steps he heard, and investigators never confirmed whether the sound preceded any exterior movement. The third person is Officer Lena Garvey, age 31, the first uniformed responder to sign the initial incident number that evening. She arrived after the lights returned for 2 minutes, then went down again as if the circuit tripped under load. Garvey walked the alley with a flashlight and found a bicycle leaned beside a trash enclosure behind the laundry room. The bicycle reportedly belonged to Connor, though the county file from 2009 notes the registration sticker was unreadable under winter grime. Records conflict over whether the seat height matched his last measurement, and investigators never confirmed if another child borrowed the bike earlier. Dispatch logs show multiple calls about power fluctuations and elevator alarms during the same half hour across adjacent blocks. A maintenance crew radioed a transformer smell near the corner convenience store, then lost contact when their handhelds failed inside a cinder block stairwell. An outage map captured by a local blogger shows a blotch along 8th Avenue, shaded deeper where circuits overlapped across feeders. The image circulated widely that week, and some locals claimed it proved a deliberate shutdown rather than a fault. Investigators never confirmed the blogger's data source, and state records cautioned that crowd screenshots often distort the real switching boundaries. According to the mother's statement, Connor stayed home with a list on the fridge and reminders about homework and the hallway light. She took the bus toward Lake Otis before sunset and called once from the break room during the first reported flicker. The call dropped after a greeting, and she told detectives the silence felt routine during a storm watch. She tried again on her next break and reached voicemail, then contacted her brother, who said he would drive back immediately. Dispatch logs note her third call at shift change, when she reported her nephew missing and asked for a unit to check the duplex. When Garvey stepped inside, the apartment air was cool and smelled like wet socks and an open box of detergent. A pot of macaroni sat crusted on the stove, and a pencil lay under worksheets spread across the table. The window looked toward a utility pole where a crossarm leaned, reportedly cracked by wind during a squall that crossed the water earlier. Garvey noted a jacket missing from hooks by the door and found boots damp with slush left in the corner. The county file from 2009 emphasizes that damp boots were common that month, and investigators never confirmed whether Connor owned another pair. Anchorage police coordinated with utility crews who were moving along feeders to test for faults after repeated trips under load. A crew chief told officers the substation protection had isolated a bad run and that service would stabilize after switching. The crew chief also mentioned a brief arc recorded on supervisory screens around the time neighbors reported the boy leaving. Archived notes capture his phrasing carefully, and state records remind readers that arcs happen often during winter switching. Some locals claimed the arc aligned with the alley and suggested an electrical scare might have drawn the boy outside, though investigators never confirmed that scenario. A security camera at the convenience store faced the corner, then turned off when the outage rolled across that grid square. The owner found corrupted files on the recorder, reportedly caused by repeated starts that exceeded the small battery's tolerance. Two frames remained legible, showing a figure with a hood stepping past stacked bags of ice and pausing at the curb. The height and jacket length were consistent with a small teenager, though shadows widened the outline against the snow. Records conflict on whether the hood carried a stitched logo, and investigators never confirmed a clear facial image from those frames. Searchers walked the Chester Creek Trail the next morning, moving slowly where tire ruts froze into ridges beside the path. A volunteer found a glove near a bench, blue knit with stretched wrist seams and a smudge of grit on two fingers. The mother said Connor owned gloves like that, then grew uncertain when shown a photo that made the knit look darker. The item entered evidence with a notation about uncertain ownership and environmental contamination from overnight frost. Dispatch logs record a second glove reported near the lagoon, then withdrawn when the caller failed to answer a callback, and investigators never confirmed its existence. Is less than hashone. Zero hash is greater than. Reese told detectives he took out trash during the outage and watched headlights scatter on wet pavement along the alley mouth. He believed he saw two silhouettes at the corner, one short and one taller, moving quickly toward a bus stop without speaking. The taller figure held a bag that knocked against a thigh, and the smaller shape glanced back once, then ducked behind a plow berm. Reese admitted uncertainty about distance because a neighbor's generator vibrated metal stairs, blurring his focus during the observation. Archive notes repeat that admission twice, and state records mark the sighting as uncorroborated, though the timing matched the outage window closely. The uncle described his errand as routine, a circuit of two stores that usually carried batteries and a small propane canister. He said traffic stalled along C Street because signals blinked, then went dark, and drivers edged through with horn taps. He circled once near the duplex, saw the stairwell light flash, and assumed the unit would stabilize after the next switch. When he reached the door, he called the boy's name and found quiet rooms and a page of homework under a phone. Records conflict over whether he entered the building on his first pass, and investigators never confirmed his drive path using available cameras. During interviews, classmates mentioned a plan for sledding after the next snowfall, with a meeting point near a small park in Midtown. One friend reportedly texted about a borrowed sled and a repaired headlamp that could run on backup batteries. The phone recovered from the table contained an unfinished reply that referenced the headlamp but not the meeting point specifically. The county file from 2009 highlights the gap between the unfinished reply and the last status report recorded by the device. Investigators never confirmed whether the boy intended to leave for that plan during the outage, though some locals claimed they heard excited voices outdoors. Weather logs show gusts along the inlet that lifted salty spray and glazed sidewalks through brief freezing drizzle. Utility crews reported linemen slipping on ladders and pausing work to salt rails at a substation gate. A transit driver radioed about passengers crowding on board while streetlights remained dark, then asked dispatch for guidance about unsupervised minors. That message appears in dispatch logs 3 minutes after the first welfare check, placing both threads inside the same operational window. Investigators never confirmed whether the driver passed the boy's block, and state records refrained from connecting those events beyond proximity and shared conditions. A resident 2 buildings east kept a paper notebook for power blinks because appliances sometimes failed during voltage dips. He wrote times in blocky numbers and kept tallies for each blink counted in the kitchen with a candle burning nearby. His notes include a scribble labeled child voice, then a short arrow toward the alley where the bicycle was recovered earlier. Archived notes indicate the resident could not recall whether the voice came before or after the second deep blackout. The county file from 2009 cautions that manual notations during outages are notoriously fuzzy, and investigators never confirmed the accuracy of the marks. By the second day, snow hardened into ruts and footprints lost shape under municipal plow passes along the trail network. A drone team flew grids above the greenbelt, then battled interference near transmission lines that hummed as power stabilized across feeders. The team reported brief signal jitter along one corridor that paralleled the alley and turned toward a drainage culvert under the avenue. Some locals claimed the jitter implied an object inside the culvert, though the pilot later tested and reproduced interference near similar lines. Investigators never confirmed any anomaly beyond routine radio noise, and state records treat the flight logs as inconclusive but properly archived. Several tips arrived from neighborhoods west of Minnesota Drive, where residents reported a boy matching Connor's height near a bus kiosk. One caller described a child in a gray jacket asking about a route to turn again, then walking away when a bus arrived. Another caller insisted the boy rode north toward a stop near Northern Lights, carrying a bag shaped like a folded sled. The uncle told officers Connor did not own a folding sled, then paused and said a friend might have loaned one earlier. Records conflict on whether that friend was contacted promptly, and investigators never confirmed the kiosk sightings beyond uncollected footprints on packed snow. On the third day, the mother returned to the duplex with an officer and found a faint shoe mark on the stairwell landing. The print was partial, smudged by slush, and measured close to the size the boy wore during the previous winter. A second print overlapped at an angle that suggested a quick turn toward the alley door rather than the interior hallway. Photographs entered the county file from 2009 show grainy edges and flash reflections from chipped paint across the riser. Some locals claim the prints proved a rushed exit, though investigators never confirmed gate direction from marks that degraded under repeated entries. A week later, state records show the case coded for continuing investigation with periodic checks when new outage reports surface. Utilities repaired the cracked crossarm and replaced fuses that had tripped during the storm, then published a maintenance summary on their website. The summary listed the outage window within broader operations and mentioned no injuries recorded during the night of the disappearance. Families in the neighborhood saved copies of the page, and archived notes record residents arguing over the meaning of terse language. Investigators never confirmed any link between the maintenance summary and the case, and dispatch logs closed the thread without additional explanation. The mother kept working nights, reportedly moving to a different facility after winter gave way to an early break in ice. She told a counselor she avoided the alley and took a longer path around the block when errands required walking past the stairwell. Reese transferred to a different building, and the uncle changed shifts at the parts store, then stopped answering reporters who knocked. Some locals claimed these changes were meaningful, while neighbors said people adjust their routes when winter ends and work schedules shift. The county file from 2009 preserves both views without judgment, and investigators never confirmed that any adjustment held investigative weight. Years later, the duplex paint flaked in the same stairwell, and the door closer still dragged when the hallway cooled. A new tenant found a child's library card under the second step, then turned it over to a clerk downtown. The clerk checked the number and found the card expired before the outage, then wrote a note that attached to the record. Archived notes say the mother could not identify the card as her son's, and records conflict on the listed address. Investigators never confirmed a connection, though the discovery reopened conversations that move through Anchorage whenever lights flicker against winter clouds. The vanished miner of Nome Ridge. In early summer of 2019, a seasonal miner booked a bunk in Nome and walked the ridgeline above town alone. He carried a used metal detector, a battered pack, and a claim map folded into quarters inside a plastic sleeve. Several weeks later, searchers traced his tracks to wined, scraped gravel, and a shallow cut marked by recent shovel bites. Locals reportedly still point to that slope when the north breeze lines the tundra grass and the sea turns gray. His name was Daniel Kerr, 48, a heavy equipment operator from Fairbanks who prospected small leases during seasonal breaks and layoffs. Archived notes kept by a borough clerk say he told the front desk he wanted 3 quiet weeks near Anvil Creek. He paid cash for a room 2 blocks from Front Street and asked for a ground floor unit facing the alley. The clerk wrote that he spoke calmly, carried no visible weapon, and wore rubber boots with dried clay seams. State records show Kerr renewed a limited entry claim the previous winter and mailed 2 small payments from a post office kiosk. The county file from 2009 includes a faded survey of the same bench, annotated with pencil arrows around a shallow tributary bend. Some locals claimed an older prospector had washed flakes there after a flood rearranged bars along the creek mouth. Investigators never confirmed whether Kerr knew those stories, though a library sign-out shows he borrowed 2 regional mining guides. On a Tuesday, dispatch logs recorded a weather advisory for dense coastal cloud and intermittent drizzle, with ceiling low and visibility variable. A taxi receipt in his room lists a drop at the Dome Creek pullout just before noon, with gear loaded in careful stages. A store owner later told troopers he sold Kerr fuel mix, replacement hose, and a handheld radio that could scan aviation traffic. None of those items were recovered at the site where his footprints ended among scattered cobbles and straw-colored sedge. The first person to sound an alarm was Lena White, 36, a clerk who managed checkouts and kept the lodge keyboard. She reportedly noticed his key still hanging late Thursday, then again Friday morning, with bedsheets unwrinkled and towels folded inside the rack. Her archived notes mention 2 missed conversations about a package and a quiet guest who nodded often but avoided long exchanges. She called the non-emergency line and asked whether a welfare check made sense, then waited while staff inspected the empty room. Deputy Mark Oden, 41, flew in from Kotzebue to assist troopers with a grid search once a formal report was filed. He interviewed White, the taxi driver, and a maintenance worker who remembered helping Kerr carry a small pump to the curb. Oden later described the man as methodical and polite, with a list on notebook paper and a preference for working alone. He also noted conflicting accounts of departure time and load weight, details which investigators never reconciled despite repeated calls and follow-up visits. A team walked the ridge north of town and found shovel marks, a cleared path through dwarf willow, and boot prints with broad, shallow tread. The prints crossed a frost scar, skirted a hollow with pooled meltwater, and paused near a rust-stained boulder shaped like a wedge. A torn glove finger lay beside small pebbles sorted into a checkered sample tray, arranged as if awaiting a short return. Beyond that point, the ground turned hard, mixed with stones polished by freeze and thaw, and the pattern thinned into scuffs. Searchers followed a faint line downslope where wind had planed the surface smooth and left only darker grit between sparse lichens. A wide arc of boot marks then reappeared beside a patched tarp weighted with rocks, with cup rings and a foil packet lying nearby. Troopers collected the items and photographed a shallow trench with damp sides that suggested recent work before weather closed again. Investigators never confirmed whether the trench held any payable material, since it had partly slumped and pooled under the light rain. Reports from that week document 3 helicopter passes and 2 dog teams that worked in widening circles along gullies cut by melt streams. One handler mentioned scented trace near an abandoned culvert where snow lingered beneath brush despite warm air and steady coastal light. Another handler disagreed and wrote that the dogs were reacting to old human routes left by hikers and berry pickers in previous seasons. Records conflict over how long the team stayed in the highest zone, since fog reportedly rolled over the ridge each afternoon. Back in town, Oden checked cameras along Front Street and a service station where Kerr had bought coffee and fuel in a plastic can. Footage shows him scanning a folded map, speaking briefly with a fisherman, and noting something on a receipt before stepping into the parking lot. The fisherman later recalled a curious question about river levels and an interest in outflow timing when coastal winds pushed against freshwater. Investigators never confirmed whether that conversation influenced Kerr's route choice, though the creek mouth was not part of the official grid. A second search concentrated on drainage cuts south of the ridge where meltwater gathered in shallow slots that deepened toward muskeg and scattered pools. Volunteer notes describe thin ice inside shaded pockets, boot sinking to ankle depth, and a rhythmic clink from stones shifting underfoot. One volunteer reportedly found a strip of duct tape with a partial thumbprint that matched nothing in available files. Another found a snack wrapper that matched lodge vending stock, though state records say the batch code was common in several towns. As days passed, a working theory formed that Kerr may have backtracked unseen and taken a lower traverse when fog reduced visibility. That idea fit with the arc-shaped prints and the trench location, as if he wanted to reach his tarp without climbing again. It did not explain the missing pump, the radio, or the hose, which should have been bulky enough to impede movement. Investigators never confirmed whether a second cache existed farther down the slope, despite repeated sweeps and systematic probing of shallow depressions. A guide who knew the hill said a snow machine trail sometimes hardened into a deceptive ribbon that drew walkers toward an older cut. Some locals claimed that cut ended abruptly at a short headwall where loose gravel slid under light steps and carried people sideways. The guide's statement appears in archived notes, along with a sketch of the headwall and an arrow pointing toward a low bench. Records conflict on whether that bench was searched with poles or only scanned from above while fog drifted through the notch. Dispatch logs capture a week of calls from relatives and coworkers who described Kerr as steady, frugal, and rarely prone to risk. A union steward from Fairbanks said he never drank on shift and disliked crowds, preferring quiet cabins where he could read old manuals. A former foreman reportedly remembered a habit of marking bolts with lacquer to track vibration and a pocket notebook filled with measurements. None of those details offered a clear reason for a wrong step, a sudden detour, or a decision to leave equipment behind. During a final sweep, searchers found a shallow imprint shaped like a knee beside a tangle of willow pulled up by the roots. A few inches away, a smear of damp soil crossed a rock face and ended in grains pressed into a pattern like fabric. Photographs show no blood and no obvious shoe print, only disturbed grit and a thread that matched the torn glove finger. Investigators never confirmed whether the marks indicated a stumble, since wind picked up overnight and sanded the surface into a uniform crust. In late summer, the case file grew thin as weather improved and seasonal crews rotated home, leaving notes and maps in labeled folders. A short memorandum proposes that Kerr intended to sample at 3 points along a side channel where the creek bent around a low rise. Another memorandum argues he likely aimed for the mouth to watch conditions during a falling tide that could concentrate heavier grains near cobble bars. Records conflict on estimated timeframes, since the taxi drop was imprecise and cloud patterns disrupted any meaningful shadow analysis. White kept a copy of the missing poster taped near the keyboard and wrote dates beside calls that asked the same questions. She reportedly told a visiting brother that the room stayed quiet for weeks, though the alley sometimes carried diesel scent after midnight. Her notebook ends with a line about returning a deposit and boxing 3 shirts for storage behind the desk with other unclaimed items. Investigators never confirmed whether a family member retrieved the box, since shipping records list only a surname and illegible initials. In autumn, a hunter spotted a rectangle of blue fabric near frost, stunted spruce, and radioed coordinates before weather closed again over the hills. A team hiked the bearing and found only a faded tarp shard, a snapped grommet, and marks from fox tracks in soft ground. The shard color matched nothing cataloged in evidence, and the grommet style differed from the tarp photographed at the trench site. State records list that lead as inconclusive and recommend renewed searches when spring snow recedes and the ground unlocks along the gullies. Years later, the ridge still draws walkers on long evenings when the light stretches and the sea reflects a dull metallic band. Some locals claimed the miner's cache lies near an old drift where meltwater vanishes into gravel and reappears below a low natural sill. Others point toward the head wall and say the bench gave way in thaw, swallowing a footprint and smoothing everything into wind-polished stone. Investigators never confirmed any of those theories, and the county file from 2009 remains a caution about incomplete ground. The story ends without resolution beyond the paper trail, a set of maps, and careful handwriting that measured days and minor purchases. Dispatch logs, state records, and archive notes describe a quiet man who planned small tasks and walked uphill before fog settled again. The ridge faces the sea and the town lights, and its gravel shifts each season when freeze and thaw pull stones apart. Kerr's name remains on a page that lodges between tabs, and the ridge keeps its distances when the wind crosses gently. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Merrick almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Merrick knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fissures along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Merrick checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the third night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Merrick drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the north yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Merrick did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Merrick wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Merrick stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet map. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest, and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fare. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered, as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found 2 pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement, and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ortis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with 2 techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The text said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ordis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high-water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The Bridge Collapse Files of Red River County. Locals in Clarksville still point toward the slow bend of the Red River and mention a span that failed without warning. They talk about a sound like lumber snapping across a barnyard and a brown cloud that rolled off the water. Some say the river went quiet for a full minute. Others insist the current rushed harder against the pilings. The event sits between printed pages and tired memories, where dates blur and names drift across coffee counters. Investigators never confirmed a single narrative, and the surviving paperwork reads like a map with two north arrows. The first name that appears across the county file from 2009 is Thomas Avery, 52, consulting civil engineer, in town to review seasonal scour near the east abutment. He arrived from Texarkana on a rented pickup, carried a folding stadia rod, and booked a room at a roadside motor court. His notes, reportedly scanned and misplaced twice, show pencil sketches with neat arrows along gravel approaches. He wrote that spring runoff had undercut a clay shelf and that riprap placement lagged a full year. He planned a second pass at lower water with a contractor present and a county foreman on site. Dispatch logs from the same period reference Maria Kent, 41, paramedic with Red River EMS, sent toward the span after a motorist report about drifting planks. Her unit rolled north on farm-to-market roads with steady radio checks and a quiet engine whine. The log timestamps conflict with her own written addendum, which places her arrival 8 minutes before the first deputy. She noted empty guardrails and a harder breeze from the west that pushed dust into the shallows. She stayed at the south approach and waited for a crew to secure a lane with cones and a chain. A third figure threads through state records and later summaries: Caleb Ross, 29, county road crew foreman, scheduled to meet Avery for a survey walk. He reportedly left the yard early with a steel tape, a faded vest, and a thermos dented along one side. The daybook from his shop lists a fuel top off at 6, a load of rock at 7, and a plan to check the far pier before lunch. Some locals claimed Ross stopped at a grocery for ice and never returned to the truck. Others stated he reached the bridge and waved toward the river. The record of his exact route remains unsettled, and the receipt pile is thinner than expected. Archive notes say the span was a modest truss with timber decking and 3 concrete piers set in an easy channel. The far bank rose into cottonwoods, and the near bank held a graded turnout where anglers backed trailers down a slab. Maintenance logs speak of patched planks and a cracked bearing plate that had been shimmed on a wet afternoon. The repair order shows a red pencil remark that reads, "Still serviceable under single lane only." No one signed a final clearance, and the renewal request died in a stack under a broken stapler. When the structure failed, the sequence becomes a field of magnets pulling in different directions that never quite align. One witness claimed the center deck dropped first and sent a chalky burst downstream. Another insisted the south approach slumped after a truck braked near the crown. A rancher reported hearing 2 distinct impacts with river echoes that sounded like a hallway door. A retired teacher described one long groan as if the river dragged a wet rope across iron. The statements share details but resist consensus, and each page announces certainty with careful handwriting. Avery's pocket notebook surfaced in a banker's box long after the final insurance letter closed. The pages record a sounding taken with a weighted line that read 14 near the mid-channel and 9 closer to the leaning pier. He wrote that drift loads had increased after a storm in early spring and that the upstream pile showed fresh scars. There is a sketch of a void under the clay lip where minnows flick through pale water. He underlined a sentence about scour mitigation with quarry stone and a call to confirm availability within 2 weeks. Kent filed her final report with a tone that suggests fixed habits and a tired office chair. She lists scene hazards that include rebar ends, loose decking, and silt clouds that limit visibility under the truss. She notes a single pickup at the turnout with no occupants and an open toolbox on the tailgate. She records a radio check to County Fire and a request for mutual aid from a neighboring district. Her remarks end with a line about river traffic and 2 anglers who declined to provide names due to a pending tournament. Ross appears next in a terse memo that cites secondhand remarks and a phone call that reached voicemail twice. The memo claims he had walked the south bank with Avery a week earlier and marked 3 soft pockets with orange paint. It suggests he planned to return with fabric and stone once the river fell below the chalk line on the pier. The last certain fact is a signed receipt for gloves and a set of safety glasses at a hardware counter near the square. Every later detail arrives from someone who heard something in a cafe and tucked it between lunch notes. State records list 2 inspections spread across 5 years, with photographs that show a lean toward the east and a hairline crack along a bearing seat. The earlier inspection recommended a load posting that never appeared on either approach. The later inspection assigned a priority that competed with 3 other spans and a culvert collapse on a farm road. A funding note mentions a grant request that stalled after a change in office staff. The document trail grows faint as winter budgets pressed into spring potholes. Mechanical analysis came from a district engineer who used calm sentences and short clauses built for public meetings. He identifies repeated wetting and drying cycles along the timber deck that forced nails to creep. He points toward undermined clay and a narrowed channel that bent current lines against the mid-pier. He writes that a failure origin cannot be fixed with absolute precision due to scoured evidence and missing deck pieces. He asks for a dewatering plan and a crane that never materialized. The county file from 2009 includes photographs with date stamps that do not match the captions typed below. One frame shows a sagging guardrail with rust blooms and a waterline printed like a belt across concrete. Another shows tire marks that end at a splintered edge and a hat resting on a plank. A third shows an empty river surface patterned by wind from the west and a line of bubbles near the far pier. The chain of custody sheet lists a deputy who transferred out and a clerk who retired without an exit interview. Reporters drew maps on legal pads and drove the approaches with a cautious speed of someone reading old pavement for hints. Their articles stitched interviews with shop owners and two fishermen who claimed the river changed color after the first impact. One piece quoted a former inspector who said budget cycles have their own weather and you dress for whatever arrives. Another quoted a county commissioner who insisted the span stood within normal service metrics. The printed narratives offered resolve, while the river ignored the words and moved on. Avery left town within a week, recorded by a receipt for fuel and a breakfast ticket punched with a dull hole. He returned once in late summer to present a slide deck with cross-sections and equation lines that bored the room. He recommended stone placement and new bearings cut for the southern seat. He suggested a temporary Bailey to restore a single lane with strict limits. The minutes reflect nods without motion and a closing remark about waiting for cooler weather. Kent rotated off the ambulance for a quarter and took dispatch shifts under bright fluorescent light that flattened the hours. She handled calls about livestock on roads and a boy with a broken wrist and an older man short of breath. When the bridge comes up, her voice stays neutral while her hands move over paper with careful steadiness. She writes that the river remains a hazard zone and that signage needs nightly checks. She never claims more than the logs can support, and her addenda end with standard phrasing. Ross's path fades, where the road leaves town and crosses open fields toward the old ferry traces. Some locals claimed he was seen near the cottonwoods with a level rod, others placed him at a diner booth that never matched the receipt times. A cousin remembered a story about hauling stone past sunset while the radio caught distant stations. A former coworker insisted Ross called about fabric rolls and left a voicemail that never saved. The file keeps his name, but not his last location, and the river keeps its distance from closure. By winter, the approaches were fenced with mesh, and the signs leaned under north wind that smelled like iron. A temporary span sat in the planning folder and moved between committees like a slow truck. The budget hearings pressed on with pipe repairs and a school roof that leaked onto maps. The river dropped into pale seams across sandbars, and the water showed twisted metal like ribs. People drove around the detour and learned new turns that soon felt old. In spring, a work crew staged rock on the south bank and built a ramp with compacted fill and a simple slope. They moved stone against the lean of the current and watched the water change sound as voids filled. They left gaps where the divers wanted clear space and marked a lane with tall posts. A man with a clipboard checked quantities while a crane idled near the turnout. Nothing in the record names him, and no photograph shows his face. Years later, the road pulls straight toward a replacement span that rides higher over a more disciplined channel. The guardrails shine against early sun, and the deck hums under light traffic that stays within the posted signs. Downstream, the old pilings sit in shallow water like molars under a tired gum line. People fish near the shade and glance toward the bank where the gravel turnout still holds a hard edge. The current moves past their boots and says nothing that a recorder can keep. The file ends without a conclusive sentence, and the county clerk wrote, "Closed for now," along the final margin. The failure sits among numbers and measured lines and voices that hold equal conviction. The river holds its own private archive and never shares the index with the courthouse. The names remain in lists that wait for some future reader to try another alignment. Paper can repeat a story, yet the sound that began the story does not return. The stories. This highway turnout kept a separate roadside ledger. The turnout sat 3 miles past the hill crest, where the shoulder widened and an old guardrail curled around scrub pines. It looked like any layover patch on a western freight route, wind-scoured and sun-bleached, the kind of place drivers used when the low gear cooked too hot. Ivo Calderon was 34 and worked highway maintenance out of a county yard near a small valley town. He had the steady patience of someone who counted reflectors at dawn, and he kept a pocket notebook for bolts that liked to work loose. He planned a simple loop that Tuesday: swap a cracked mile marker, replace a dented sign, check the culvert at the turnout. He pulled the county pickup beside the rail and killed the engine, and the quiet after the fan belt felt too clean. He had heard drivers call the turnout a good place to let brakes breathe, and earlier dispatch chatter mentioned a stalled sedan reported before sunrise. The sedan was gone now, but a dark rectangle pressed into gravel showed where tires had slept. He walked the rail, tapped bolts with a wrench, and found a new scar where the metal had curled inward like a knuckle. He crouched to look for glass or plastic, and his fingers met tin. The box felt cold despite the heat, wedged under the rail post with two flat rocks bracing it tight. He checked for snakes first, then slid it out with a sand scuff. Inside was a ledger wrapped in a cut trash bag, bound with string, edges rubbed thin as old denim. On the first page, someone had printed Mile 37 turnout, keep it dry, return it where you found it. The handwriting was neat, each line pressed with a heavy hand that understood trucks and weather. The early entries read like a log of small trades, which made sense in that place and on that road. Diesel siphoned and replaced with cash, jump starts marked with initials, spare brake light bulbs counted like borrowed pencils. The dates were written carefully as words, like 2019 and 2020, and then the numbers stopped for a while when the world went strange. He flipped to a recent page and noticed a different style, lighter ink and quicker strokes that curled on the downstroke. It said, "Skimmer crew parked by mile 32 according to a driver. Call the county before you accept a tow." Another said, "Gray sedan with a trailer ball gave bottles and left at dawn. Check camera near the crest for plate." He looked at the tin again and found a folded slip beneath the ledger that smelled like lemon cleaner. Someone had written, "If you find this and you work the road, please look at dispatch logs from last winter." He recognized the phrasing and the gentle push, not a demand, more like a tired neighbor asking you to look through a fence. He set the ledger back in the tin, snapped a quick photo for memory, and secured the box the way he had found it. The air felt still, and a low thunder came from the downshift of a distant semi that needed the long lane more than talk. He got in the truck, scratched a date in his pocket notebook, and drove back toward the yard with the uneasy feeling of stepping on a path with fresh footprints. In the office after lunch, he pulled archived calls on the shared computer, which the crew used for storm maps and shift swap. The log from late winter listed a cluster of calls around mile 30, with drivers reporting a two-truck team that arrived fast and unasked. One entry used the word predatory, which was rare in casual notes, and another mentioned cash prices on a scrap of paper. He kept reading and saw a note from a county deputy about skimmers on card readers at a nearby fuel plaza. That plaza sat between the crest and the river bridge, where drivers liked to grab coffee and plug in sleepers to keep a steady chill. He printed the page, then printed the call clusters, and wrote the turnout mile in the margins because he trusted his own ink. The next morning, he returned to the route early, with a thermos and a camera that clipped to the dash like a square eye. He planned to change a reflector near the crest and let the camera watch the turnout. Nothing secret, just habit dressed as curiosity. The road held a thin fog that looked like breath on glass, and the pines below the rail felt damp enough to keep a secret. He parked, waited a few minutes, and watched a box truck pull in slow with brakes sighing like someone settling into a couch. A woman climbed out, mid-40s, hair tied back, shoulders set like someone who carried more than straps and ratchets. She checked her wheels, knocked her lugs with a bar, then walked to the guardrail with a mason jar wrapped in a towel. She crouched where the tin lived, did not look around, and worked like a person who practiced in silence and noticed the small things. She took the ledger out, slid in the folded towel, wrote 3 lines, then added a smaller page clipped by a binder clip that made a sharp click. He felt guilty watching and looked down to pretend his coffee needed attention, which it did not, but pretend worked anyway. He waited until she left, then pretended to check the culvert again, this time with a small shovel that made the roll feel official. He eased the tin out, opened the ledger to the fresh page, and read a tidy note that felt like a breadcrumb. It said, "Tow crew again, near mile 32 last night, reportedly told a young driver they worked with the county." Another line said, "I am leaving 4 bottles of coolant and a bag of rags for anyone stuck with a pinhole." He wrote a line himself, kept to the ledger tone, and made sure the ink did not bleed through on the thin paper. He wrote, "County maintenance checked the turnout, no affiliation with tow crews, call dispatch if pressured." He tucked his page under the binder clip and slid everything back, angling the rocks to wedge firm because small rituals matter when the wind gets ideas. He drove to the fuel plaza later that morning, the one near the bridge where the skimmers had allegedly lived, and asked around. The cashier, a young guy with a careful haircut, said a retired radio operator sometimes handed out paper maps to drivers who looked lost. Reportedly, he kept notes on who needed help and who pushed scams, and he liked the old ways more than the new screens. The cashier said, "You want Arlene, not me," and pointed at the small sandwich counter where a woman was sorting bread with clean hands. Arlene had the posture of someone who had stood for decades without complaint, and her eyes moved fast, like she listened with more than ears. She listened to Ivo explain his job and his curiosity, then nodded once, like a shop teacher hearing a decent plan. She said, "There is a book, but we do not write full names because we do not want fights here." She said, "Some truckers leave notes about who helped, and sometimes they warn about boys who show up too fast with chains." She added, "A retired dispatcher named Theo started it after 2014 when the corner got tricky, and people forgot how to flag without yelling." Ivo asked if anyone had brought up mile 32 in the last month, and she looked past him like she was reading a chalkboard on a far wall. She said, "A kid in a small coupe said 2 trucks boxed him at night and tried to sell a winch like a miracle." She said the kid left when another driver pulled behind him with hazards blinking, which often makes a different kind of math happen. He thanked her and bought a sandwich he had not planned to buy, then sat in his truck and wrote lines in his pocket notebook. He marked the phrases retired dispatcher, ledger, tow scam, and noted that older hands tend to leave cleaner trails than noisy crews. He waited for his coffee to cool, then called the deputy listed on the winter logs and left a message saying he was checking a few things near the crest. The deputy called back that afternoon, voice calm, words clipped like someone who learned to talk over traffic noise. The deputy said there had been several reports of quick tow teams and a few complaints about skimmers, but nothing firm enough for a charge. He added that a neighbor near the climb heard engines idling around midnight often, and his dog growled the way dogs do when a rhythm is wrong. Ivo returned to the turnout at dusk with a reflective vest and a flashlight because nothing good happens when you pretend the dark is friendly. He checked the tin and found another page, this one printed with careful block letters like a patient teacher. It said, "If you need to know, check the gate camera on the service road above the crest and ask for last January." He knew the service road, a narrow cut that served a radio tower, and a wind monitor the county refused to replace. The gate had an old camera that fed a shared system, which logged plates and headlights more than faces and worked better than anyone expected. He sent a request through the county portal and asked for January footage from late night hours, and the reply came with a link and a warning about file size. He watched the clips after dinner on the break room monitor because the screen at home had a cracked corner he never fixed. In one clip, the turnout sat dark and empty until a pair of flatbeds eased in like wolves that knew the fence lines. Minutes later, a small hatchback rolled to a stop, hazard lights pulsing a tired heartbeat, and the flatbeds moved as if pulled by the same string. He watched the first driver step out and talk with quick hands, then watched the second driver circle the hatchback like it had a scent. A third vehicle pulled in and stopped behind the hatchback, a high sleeper with long antenna wires and an American flag sticker on the lower door. The hatchback backed away slow, then faster, and left the turnout with the sleeper following, which made the flatbeds idle in place. Next, he watched late January. And this clip hurt because the rain made everything shine like a wet stage where actors forgot their lines. A refrigerated trailer pulled in with smoke from one wheel, a soft gray that looked almost polite until it thickened at the edges. Within minutes, 2 figures worked the hub, one with a small extinguisher, one holding a flashlight, steady and calm, even as the smoke turned rude. The next page of the ledger joined the footage in his mind and made something click that felt like a seatbelt slipping into place. The page listed a night where a driver named Ash met a retired radio man who carried a milk crate of fuses and flagged traffic by feel. It said Ash made it to the next exit and left a case of water behind the rail as thanks, and the radio man refused cash with a stubborn grin. He started to suspect the ledger was not only a list of favors or warnings, but a quiet schedule for kindness that traveled under the grid. The binder clips held more than paper, they held little runs of trust, and a handful of people had decided the turnout would be a tiny town square. He still had to connect the tow crews to something more firm, or at least line up a clean path between names and nights. He reviewed the January footage again, then compared timestamps against dispatch logs, and found a gap where a call had been recorded but then labeled incomplete. The call preview mentioned a shaky voice saying 2 trucks had blocked a lane near mile 32, and another voice saying help was already on the way. The logs showed no county units listed, and the note ended with line dropped, likely lost signal. He printed the clip stills and wrote notes by hand, careful to keep letters large and unhurried because speed ruined more ink than rain. He visited the plaza again and asked Arlene if she knew a retired radio man named Theo, which made her mouth twitch like a bad joke arrived late. She said Theo still came in on Thursdays to trade old surplus radios for stories he liked better than the radios themselves. On Thursday, she waved Evo to a small table near the window where a thin man sat with a canvas cap and a careful breath. Theo looked at the stills without touching them and asked easy questions about wind direction and how long the trucks had stayed put. He read the ledger note photocopy and raised one eyebrow at the refund line where someone had scratched out an unkind word. Theo said, "That book started when we lost a pullout after a washout in 2014 and needed somewhere to map goodwill." He said, "We kept names light on purpose. No addresses, no hero stories, just notes that kept people honest enough to look in the mirror." He added, "I have reported the cruise twice with plates, but the plates led to a rental maze that likes to erase footprints." Ivo asked if Theo would mind adding a line that county maintenance knew the ledger existed, and Theo nodded once like a metronome. He wrote in a tight script, "County eyes know this book and prefer its honesty, no affiliation with any tow company." He slid the pen back with 2 fingers, then told a quick story about a snow chain locker that used to freeze shut and how a hammer can respect stubborn metal without breaking it. The next week, Evo placed a small metal cabinet behind the rail, painted brown like the dirt, no markings, no lock, just a storm latch. Inside, he put rags, coolant, a cheap inflator, and a folded card that said, "Call dispatch and wait if anyone pressures you about towing." The ledger went into the cabinet with its tin, and a note asked writers to close the latch because the wind enjoyed rude jokes. Word spread in the slow way good habits move when they do not ask for attention or applause. Drivers left cleaner notes with times and directions that avoided names, and one traveler wrote a careful line about a black dog that lay near the rail at night to watch tires pass like planets. A deputy added, quietly and without badge number, that a new camera watched the mile 32 shoulder from an angle the crews did not expect. In early summer, a box truck driver named Kelda wrote about a man who flagged her down and pointed to a soft tire, then asked for cash. She wrote, "I offered water and a phone call, and he left without names," and a second car watched from the shadow near the sign. 2 days later, someone wrote, "Gray sedan again, park lights off, backed away when 2 vehicles pulled in together. Report filed at the substation." The plaza cashier taped a simple note near the register that said, "Tow authorization is free by county phone. Ask before you pay anyone." The retired radio man drew a small map to the turnout for a college kid hauling a couch and told him to rest his brakes in the shade because patience kept families alive. The kid returned a week later and left a bag of chips and a soft drink in the cabinet with a note that said, "Thanks for the air." Evo felt the road change by inches, the way a river shifts after a downed tree moves just enough to stop a hidden whirl. He still checked bolts and reflectors, he still swept glass after fender kisses, he still logged storms the way farmers count clouds. He also read the ledger when the latch stuck, and he understood that small tools, shared quietly, can be stronger than loud plants. In late summer, a line appeared in a new hand, careful and slow, as if the writer wanted the words to stand up straight. It said, 2 trucks tried a price on a young couple in a silver van near mile 32 last night. Another driver blocked and called. It ended, deputies arrived, reportedly took reports, crews left before plates could be confirmed, Camera angle, improved view. Ivo printed that line for the deputy and handed over the catalyst chain he had assembled, which was not a case file, just a path. The deputy said thanks without a smile and later called to say a larger investigation had opened that spanned beyond their stretch of quiet hills. He did not ask for the ledger, and he did not tell Ivo to stop watching. He only asked that the book stay clean of full names to protect decent people. The turnout kept breathing in its slow way, heat riding off gravel in visible waves that made everything wobble and dreamlike. The ledger pages grew soft at the corners, and someone glued reinforced strips to the spine with care that matched the first handwriting. Now and then, a new driver wrote a sentence that sounded grateful for a simple jug of water left by a stranger with a pencil. A local professor left a note about starting a small roadside history project and asked if anyone minded a photocopy at the library. Theo wrote yes, but keep the copy without names, use dates written as words, and call it the Mile 37 book. The library later displayed a scan that showed a landscape of small trades and warnings, nothing dramatic, just a community stitched by traffic and time. Ivo stopped keeping his own separate notes once the system felt stable enough to grow without him tugging at every thread. He still checked the cabinet latch, still wiped dust off the tin, still tightened bolts with gloves that smelled like oil. And Sunday, he understood the ledger worked because it was specific but humble, and because no one wanted ownership beyond a steady line and clear daylight. When the wind came down from the ridge and the pines whispered like a big crowd that agreed on the same joke, the turnout looked ordinary. It still hid a storage of rags and coolant. It still held a book with entries written in hands that learned patience from asphalt. It still sat 3 miles past the crest, where trucks let their brakes breathe, and people learned to slow down enough to see one another. He remembered the first time he had levered the tin from the dust, felt the weight of words that did not need a speech. He thought about the winter calls, the quick hands at the hub, the quiet driver who blocked a box and made the math different. He thought about how a secret can be a responsibility more than a thrill, and how some secrets work best when shared carefully and left mostly unremarked. Arlene kept handing out maps and sandwiches, the cashier kept teasing drivers about their sweet tooth, and Theo kept trading radios for stories he liked better. The deputy kept watching Mile 32 from an angle that made crews uncomfortable, and the plaza lights kept throwing a honey glow across damp pavement after late rain. The road kept moving people who carried every kind of trouble and hope inside their glove boxes and on their dashboards. The ledger held a few blank pages that looked like future mornings and late nights, and the latch kept closing with a soft click. Travelers kept adding lines that sounded like a handshake, and the turnout kept holding small proof that strangers can decide to be neighbors. The book did not stop every scheme, but it hurt the margins enough that different plans made more sense than the old fast money ones. Ivo still checked the culvert after storms, still measured sediment against last season, still logged a snake sighting when a thicket rattled like loose change. He knew the ledger would change hands again eventually, not because he wanted it, but because the road decides and the people follow. He trained a new hire to watch for bolts that work loose and told him that some fixes start with a pencil and a jar. If anyone asked why the turnout mattered, he would point to the cabinet and the scrub pines and the clean lines of the rail. He would say that a book of simple favors became a ledger of safety, and that safety looked ordinary until you added up the lines. He would not mention names, and he would not tell a single hero story, because none of it needed that kind of shine. The highway kept its stubborn rhythm, and the ledger kept its quiet balance, and both felt honest in a way that made sense. The secret was not really a secret anymore, not to the people who needed it and respected what it asked. It asked for neat lines, shared tools, clear times, and the courage to arrive with hazards on and no need for applause. The stories. A final call was traced near that bridge. Late in the evening of October 5th, 2016, a storm rolled through a quiet stretch of countryside. Wind battered the old bridge over Hollow Creek, shaking the steel rails and scattering leaves across the asphalt. Around 10:32 p.m., dispatch logs show a brief, incomplete 911 call pinged off the nearest tower. The caller's voice was male, panicked, and cut off mid-sentence. Investigators later marked the audio as simply unresolved. The man behind that call was named Leon Price, 43, a long-haul truck mechanic from a nearby industrial town. He'd spent the day finishing a repair job for a delivery company, planning to drive home to his wife in time to watch a recorded game. According to coworkers, Leon left the shop around 9:40, saying he wanted to check something quick before heading home. That something was never explained. By morning, Leon's truck was found parked near the old bridge, headlights off, and driver's door locked. His phone sat on the passenger seat, the last number dialed being emergency services. The call duration? 12 seconds. No sign of a struggle. Just the smell of damp metal and mud, and a faint drag mark leading toward the railing. Search teams spent 3 days combing the area. Divers worked the shallow creek, drones scanned the woods. Nothing. Local papers speculated everything from suicide to abduction, but investigators leaned toward an accident. Maybe he'd slipped trying to inspect something under the bridge. Yet the coroner never received a body, and the case sat open as missing, presumed dead. His Nummer mens in Spix. Years later, in 2021, a city engineer named Rachel Kearns was reviewing archived bridge inspection photos for a maintenance report. In one image, taken 2 days before Leon's disappearance, a reflection caught her attention. The photo showed the lower truss beam standard shot, but in the corner, faintly lit by a maintenance flashlight, there was a silhouette of a man crouching. The timestamp placed it around dusk on October 3rd, 2 days before Leon vanished. The engineer who'd taken the photo, retired since, confirmed no one else was scheduled to be on site. Rachel forwarded the image to the county sheriff's office, and they reopened the file. Investigators re-examined Leon's work records, tracing his calls and texts from that week. One stood out. A message to a contact labeled BR sent the afternoon of October 5th. It read, asterisk, I found it, meeting at the bridge tonight. Asterisk, the number was prepaid, never registered, and disconnected within 48 hours. A detail in the message puzzled detectives. Leon wasn't known for secrecy. His wife, Dana, told them he'd been bothered for months by something from an old job, saying he'd done work he wasn't proud of for a client that refused to pay. Dana assumed it was a parts dispute, but when she mentioned a box Leon kept locked in his garage, the investigation shifted. Inside the box, police found a spiral notebook filled with maintenance records dating back to 2009, all logged under a defunct company name, Midstate Transport. Midstate had folded after a fatal trucking accident that same year, a crash investigators blamed on faulty brake lines. In a note scrawled at the back of Leon's notebook, he'd written, asterisk, proof they used counterfeit parts. Need photo evidence. Asterisk. The handwriting grew shaky near the end, as if written in haste. Detectives contacted the National Highway Safety Archive, which confirmed that a whistleblower had anonymously submitted similar claims in 2009, alleging that Midstate falsified inspection reports. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. The archived whistleblower email was traced back to a generic account created under the name LP. That bridge where Leon's final call was traced? It connected 2 counties where Midstate operated their delivery routes. According to old GPS logs, the crash that ended the company happened less than a mile from the same spot. Investigators brought in a retired dispatcher, Marvin Blake, who'd worked the radio the night of Leon's disappearance. He remembered something odd. Just after the 911 call ended, the system registered another incoming line static, then silence. It was like someone else tried calling from the same tower seconds later, he said. But the system flagged it as unregistered equipment, like a test signal. The telecom technician reviewing archive data found that the second call's source ID matched an obsolete analog handset, one last sold around 2010. Its signal strength placed it not on the bridge, but 30 yards downstream, near a maintenance access path. Detectives returned to the site. Flood levels had receded since 2016, revealing a rusted toolbox half buried in silt beneath the bridge. Inside were several brake components, a corroded camera memory card, and a name tag, Price L. The photos recovered from the card showed close-ups of serial numbers on parts stamped with counterfeit manufacturer codes exact matches to those listed in the old Mid-State case file. Forensic analysts reconstructed the final minutes of Leon's life through phone tower data and ambient audio from the recovered memory card. The recording suggested he'd been documenting the parts, likely intending to turn them in as evidence. Rain intensified, wind roared, and a loud metallic creak echoed the sound consistent with a vehicle crossing the bridge above him. Seconds later came a splash and muffled crash. The last image on the card showed Leon's flashlight beam turned toward the creek bank, and in the background, a dark SUV partially visible through the guardrails. Authorities attempted to trace any vehicles on that bridge during the window of time. Traffic cameras from the nearby highway ramp were down that night due to the storm, but one motion-activated wildlife camera a mile away captured taillights heading east around 10:35. The model matched an SUV owned by a former Mid-State executive, Brent Rowan. When questioned, Rowan denied being anywhere near the area, stating he'd sold that vehicle years prior. Records later showed the SUV's title transfer occurred 2 months after Leon's disappearance. With no physical remains and no eyewitnesses, the district attorney declined prosecution. The case was again marked unresolved. Still, among investigators, the consensus hardened that Leon Price had gone back to finish what he'd started years earlier to expose falsified safety records that cost lives. He'd arranged to meet someone that night, someone who realized too late what evidence he carried. In early 2022, bridge maintenance crews discovered a piece of phone casing embedded in the concrete ledge beneath the guardrail. Lab tests confirmed it matched Leon's model and contained trace data from his final call. The last GPS ping aligned within 3 feet of where the toolbox was found. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man burdened by guilt tried to make something right. He gathered proof of wrongdoing, arranged a meeting, and never came back. The evidence he left behind, notes, photos, the final call, spoke louder than any statement could. Dana Price still visits the site once a year. Locals say she leaves a small brass key on the railing. Investigators believe it's the key from Leon's garage lockbox, the one he'd used to hide the notebook that reopened everything. The bridge stands quiet now, repaved and monitored by new cameras. Every so often, a maintenance crew reports interference on their radios when crossing after dark. A faint echo that clips mid-word 12 seconds long, always the same. Officially, the file reads, "Case closed, pending further evidence." Unofficially, among those who worked it, the belief endures that Leon Price's final call wasn't a cry for help, but a handover. A man trying, in his last breath, to trace the truth back to where it first broke.